Um, okay, so Dr. Howie Frumkin is Senior Vice President and Director of the Land and People Lab at Trust for Public Land, a national organization that creates parks and protects land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. He's also Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington School of Public Health, where he's served as Dean. Previously, he was head of the Our Planet, Our Health initiative at the Wellcome Trust, director of the National Center for Environmental Health and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry at the CDC, professor and chair of Environmental and Occupational Health, and professor of medicine at Emory University. His career has focused on health aspects of climate change, the built environment, nature contact, and sustainability. His community and professional activities have included serving on numerous National Academy of Sciences committees, on the boards of the Bullitt Foundation, the Seattle Parks Foundation, the Washington State Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Green Building Council, Physicians for Social Responsibility, the American Public Health Association, and the National Environmental Education Foundation. He was on advisory committees to the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, the Harvard Center on Climate Health and the Global Environment, the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, the European Center of Environment and Human Health, and on the steering committee of the Planetary Health Alliance. He is author or co-author of over 300 scientific journal articles and chapters and 10 books. He was educated at Brown, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard. He's an elected member of the Washington State Academy of Sciences and of the National Academy of Medicine, and is Hagler Fellow at Texas A&M University. So he is pretty cool. And I guess take it away, Dr. Frumkin.
Well, thank you so much. That was a really nice introduction, and it would have been fine just to say he's pretty cool. That was the best part. Paul, I need to ask you to stop screen sharing, and I'll take over screen sharing if that's okay. And hello, everybody. Really nice to be here with you. And Dick, I see you just came on. Glad to see you. It feels like the party's now complete. Okay, can you all see the full screen here? That coming through? Great.
Yes.
Well, what I'd like to do is talk about one of my favorite aspects of the built environment. I bet you've all talked about transportation, and you've talked about buildings, and you've talked about lots of other things that come to mind immediately when you say built. But the built, as in be well, also includes the ways in which we encounter nature in parks and green space. And I'm going to use those terms, parks and green space, kind of interchangeably. I didn't realize till just now with the introduction that the focus of Be Well is on the UCLA campus. And so there are green spaces on the campus that essentially function as parks, that is, natural open places where people can go. They're open to the public and where people can interact with other people and recreate. So I'm going to count those as parks. And so I'll use the terms parks and green space interchangeably. And the other thing I'm going to do, just to give you a heads up, is I'm going to show you some images of scientific papers. And that's one of the most boring graphics you can imagine, but I want to drive home the point throughout, and I'm going to say it out loud now, that for some of these associations that I'll talk about that sound kind of intuitive and maybe a little woo-woo, there's actually a pretty robust evidence base. So we can be thinking about the benefits of nature contact for people, benefits of parks and green space, in just as rigorous a way as we can think about the benefits of smoking cessation or cholesterol lowering drugs or anything else. So let's start with the ways in which green space and parks promote health. I'm going to talk about 6 pathways that are shown here, and I'll take you through them one after another. This is all to make the point that parks and green space are really good for health. It's an important part of a campus, of a community, of a metropolitan area. Let's start with nature contact, the one on the top left. Nature contact is really good for people. And the picture I like to show to symbolize that is this picture of Bonor's electromagnetic bathing fluid, which my mother raised me on in the years right before the Civil War. As you can see by looking at the label, it cures neuralgia, cholera, rheumatism, paralysis, hip disease, measles, and so on. Well, actually, we don't have medicines that do this. This was a patent medicine, but The health benefits of nature contact, as I'm about to show you, offer a range of benefits for health that are just about as broad as what you see here. There's a set of mental and behavioral health benefits that are shown here: reduced stress, reduced depression and anxiety, reduced ADHD symptoms. Children, especially, have better pro social behavior. They're better at dispute resolution in natural spaces than in built spaces, and reduced aggression. And the science on this set of observations is growing pretty fast. Here are some papers just from the last year or two. One documenting fewer depressive and burnout symptoms um, during the pandemic. One, less emotional distress during the pandemic. Lower sales of mood and anxiety disorder medications in greener neighborhoods compared to less green neighborhoods. Lower suicide rates when there's more tree canopy cover. And this is a new and really interesting one. The first time this has been shown comes out of Southern California. Less postpartum depression in green neighborhoods than in less green neighborhoods. So remarkable benefits for mental and behavioral health. Also, for physical health, we have good evidence that nature contact leads to lower blood pressure, smoother, faster postoperative recovery for patients who can see nature out the window of their recovery room, better birth outcomes, improved pain control, less obesity, reduced diabetes, better eyesight. This may be due in part to better light, not just the nature contact. Hard to disentangle those two. The asthma and allergy effects are actually mixed. Better in some studies, probably because of reduction of air pollution by vegetation, but actually worse in some studies, probably because of allergenic emissions from some vegetation. And this evidence base is growing fast too. Here are some recent papers: less cardiovascular disease. A paper delightfully is called Leafier Communities, Healthier Hearts, which is kind of a motto for everything I'm going to tell you about today. Lower diabetes mortality, less preterm birth, fewer premenstrual symptoms. This is the first time, to my knowledge, this has been demonstrated, and lower COVID mortality in greener neighborhoods. And overall health and well-being, the third and final category of health benefit that I'll show you from nature: improved sleep, improved health in cancer patients, in fact, in everybody, healthier child development, longer life expectancy, greater happiness. So all of these benefits flowing from nature contact. Here are a couple of recent papers to show you how this evidence base is growing. More outdoor free play among children, fewer somatic symptoms, greater subjective well-being, greater happiness, all related to access to parks and green space or being in green neighborhoods. Now, why bring this all up? Parks and green space are where most people get to enjoy nature contact. They may go out and recreate actively, bike riding or hiking or jogging or paddling, or they may do so passively, just um, enjoying a deep dive into nature, sitting around and using nature as a backdrop for getting together with other people, just being in nature. And all of these modes of exposure, all of these modes of relating to natural environments seem to deliver the health benefits that I just went through. So that's pathway one, from parks and green space to better health. That's the fact of nature contact. The second is physical activity. I don't have to tell you that physical activity is really good for health. It improves cardiovascular profiles, reduces risk of many cancers, reduces risks of osteoporosis and depression and gallbladder disease, you name it. This is true in adults, and this is equally true in children, as these graphics from the CDC demonstrate. And the reason to bring that up is that parks and green space are a setting for physical activity. And you can see some recent papers here, some not quite so recent. But the point of showing you these papers is to show you that we have good evidence that parks and green space do serve as a venue for physical activity, but not always and not invariably. The right kind of parks and green space do much better at fomenting physical activity. And we have evidence, some of which is exemplified here, about what features of parks and green space promote physical activity. One is access. If people can't get to the park, then the park can't be a venue for physical activity. That means transit routes, it means porous boundaries between parks and neighborhoods, and so on. The next is, once you have access, people actually have to go there. If you have good access, but you don't go there, you don't get the physical activity benefits. And going there is a function of feeling safe when you get there, feeling welcome, feeling like it's an attractive destination. Then we know that facilities such as playing fields or paths or exercise stations encourage and promote physical activity. Amenities such as shade is an especially important one in increasingly hot weather. Benches, especially for elders. You don't want to go take a walk if you're elderly, if you won't be able to take a rest when you need to. Programming matters a lot. The park is not just physical infrastructure. Think of it as the hardware on which we can place software, and that's the programming. So yoga classes, organized sports, gardening, environmental volunteerism, those things attract people and promote physical activity. And good maintenance. People don't like going to parks that are neglected. And of course, the way these factors operate varies across different groups of us. Third pathway, social connectedness. And here I need to establish that we have a problem and the depth of the problem so you can appreciate the potential solution that parks offer. We have a big problem with loneliness. And as soon as I made this slide, the Surgeon General decided to come out with this report a couple of weeks ago and corroborate that we have a problem with loneliness. This is a really important report to look at if you haven't seen it. Nearly half of Americans report feeling sometimes or always alone or left out. 1 in 4 Americans rarely or never feel as though there are people who really understand them. And this, you can read these yourself, on and on. This is evidence of tremendous amount of dissociation between Americans and other Americans. People are lonely. And loneliness is bad for health. What you see here is the light blue line shows the prevalence among non-lonely people, and the dark blue line shows the prevalence among lonely people. And you can see that for each of these outcomes, sleep disorders, weight problems, substance abuse, neurologic disorders, kidney problems, loneliness can increase the prevalence of that problem by 2, even 3 times. Loneliness is bad. Loneliness is common. Loneliness is bad for health. And conversely, social connections are good for health. We have a huge body of literature on social capital and on social connectedness, showing us all of the benefits that you see listed here. So it's really good to have good friends and family and to be connected with them. And the reason to go into all this, because parks serve not only as a venue for physical activity, but as a venue for people getting together. Just take a look at the titles of some of these recently published papers. The management of urban parks and its contribution to social interactions. We know that if we configure and manage parks well, people are more likely to mix and mingle with each other. The contribution of local parks to neighborhood social ties. Urban green spaces for social interactions, health, and well-being of older people. Cultivating social capital in diverse low-income neighborhoods. So we have a very robust body of evidence demonstrating the ways in which parks and green space serve as venues for people to connect with each other. And many of the factors that predict physical activity in parks also predict social connectedness. One additional factor that I didn't show you with physical activity, and that's this longer visits. If people, it turns out empirically that if people stay longer in parks, they're more likely to mix and mingle with other people. Kind of stands to reason. We also have a problem with polarization in our society. And these are some weird but interesting graphics. I hope you think they're as interesting as I do. Here on the left, you see the overlap of Democrats and Republicans in 1994, 2004, 2014. What you can see is that the two groups are diverging, and the overlap between the two parties is becoming smaller and smaller. On the right, you see one of these big data analytics. This is a picture of retweets regarding a controversial issue. In this case, it was a ban on beef. You've got conservative people and liberal people, and each of them is retweeting almost entirely within its own tribe, indicating the echo chamber effect that we've all seen and tremendous polarization in the country. In addition to excuse me, in addition to polarization, we have a problem with racism in the country. So overall divisions between groups of people bedevil our nation. Here are some recent headlines: how race and religion have polarized American voters. America is exceptional in its political divide. We are polarizing faster than other democracies. Why bring all this up? Because parks and green space are effective at bringing people together. And you can see some headlines of recent papers here. Can urban parks bridge deep divides? Assessing the effects of interracial social interaction in parks and public spaces. Spoiler alert, if people go to parks and have contact with people from other groups, it's called intergroup contact. And if that goes well, then people emerge with less prejudice, with more positive attitudes toward other groups, and with more sense of civic connectedness. And so the things that promote those good outcomes in parks, sense of welcome and belonging, engagement and inclusion. If you belong to a minority group or an immigrant group, let's say you're from Mexico, and if you go to the park and you see Mexican murals or art or cultural iconography in the park, much likelier that you'll feel that you belong there and you'll feel welcome than if you see a park that seems to have been designed and built for other people. We also have a problem with unhappiness in the country, and this is kind of remarkable. This is from the World Happiness Report. This is the graph of general happiness among US adults from 1970s to the 2010s, and you can see that it has been declining. Sadly, this is also true of children. These are 8th, 10th, and 12th graders over the same time interval, and you can see the level of happiness dropping. In fact, this has been kind of widely reported in the media, as these headlines show. American happiness hits record lows. This may be related to declines in social connectedness, because we know that those two have a lot to do with each other. Why bring it up in this context? Because parks are happy places. Visits to urban green space have higher sentiment and lower negativity on Twitter. This is interesting. This points to a methodologic advance, which is we can use social media postings that are geolocated. We know where the smartphones are that issue these postings, and we can do free text analysis using AI and actually say something about the emotional state of people in particular physical environments, such as parks and green space. When you do that, you find out that people are happier in parks. Urban green space and happiness in developed countries. Nature makes people happy, and so on. So there's another pathway through which parks and green space can improve health, because happiness is really good for health. Next problem, and I'll stop reciting all of these problems for which parks and green space are a solution any minute now, so bear with me. We have a big problem with climate change, as you in Southern California know very well. Parks help with climate resilience. This is a park in Atlanta, Georgia. It's in a historically black part of the city. It's a low income part of the city that for years flooded when severe rainfall hit. So this park went in. This is a stormwater retention facility masquerading as a park, or it's a park masquerading as a stormwater retention facility. When the rainfall is heavy, this place absorbs hundreds of thousands of gallons of water and has reduced the flooding in the nearby houses. When it's not raining heavily, this is a great neighborhood asset, advancing not only good health through the availability of a park, but advancing equity by providing a park to a neighborhood that previously lacked it, like so many neighborhoods of color do. This is a map of New York City showing temperatures during hot weather. And those of you who have lived in New York will recognize Central Park here, much lower temperatures around the park than in other parts of the city. Here's Prospect Park down here. And you can see that the penumbra around each of these parks is degrees lower, sometimes as much as 6, 10, 12 degrees lower than in the hotter neighborhoods. So there's another pathway by which parks and green space advance health through climate resilience. And there's more that I don't have time to talk about: spiritual and aesthetic fulfillment, good for health and well-being. Air pollution reduction, generally not a major effect, but every little bit helps. Urban noise reduction. Cities are noisy places. Noise is stressful and bad for health, and parks tend to be quieter places because the vegetation serves to reduce noise. So, parks and green space help by promoting health directly and doing all those other things which promote health indirectly. Okay, Paula, how are we doing for time? Do I need to rev up?
Technically we have like 2-ish minutes, but I think we might have started a little bit late.
All right. Well, you tell me when I need to shut down, and we'll do that. We'll switch to discussion. I want to just make three meta comments if I have time. Otherwise, it's going to be two or maybe even one. The first meta comment is about equity. This proposition that parks and green space are a very health promoting part of the built environment is a great proposition supported by evidence, but there is a dark side to it, which is that we don't all have equal access to parks and green space. This is a Los Angeles map showing parks deficits. And you can see that some neighborhoods have much greater deficit of parks represented by the dark red than other neighborhoods where there's plenty of nearby parkland. My organization, Trust for Public Land, does these analyses nationwide and for most of our metro areas. And this is a recurring pattern. We have park inequities. There's been a lot of academic literature that has documented these inequities. And it is really interesting. This top one, done by Rachel Morello-Frasch and colleagues, shows that you can look at neighborhoods that were redlined almost a century ago. Redlining was a discriminatory deprivation of home loans by the Federal Home Loan Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. Almost a century later, those neighborhoods, which became minority neighborhoods, still have a deficit of parks and tree canopy. So on and on across the country, we have documented that the access to parks and green space is inequitably distributed. But the second piece of the equity story is even more interesting, and that is the equigenic effect. This is research from the UK where people are classified by social class. So it's possible to do social class analysis much more easily than in the US. So here is a graph showing the relationship between green space exposure in the neighborhood from very little or no green all the way up to very green. And what you're seeing here is the highest income group. You can see, other than this anomalous situation here, which we can talk about, that you have a downward slope, lower mortality from all-cause mortality as you get to a greener neighborhood. That's the wealthy people. Here is the middle income. Here are the middle income people. And you'll see two things. One is that the middle income people have higher mortality than the wealthy people. This is this universal and shameful reality that poor people die more than rich people. You can also see that the mortality experience decreases as they move into greener and greener neighborhoods. And here's the important thing. The rate of decline that comes with greener neighborhoods is steeper than it was for rich people. Now we get to the poorest people, much higher mortality, reduced mortality with greener neighborhoods, and a steeper yet decline. Meaning that as you get into greener neighborhoods, the disparities between the wealthy and the poor are attenuated, the so-called equigenic effect. Now, the best way to reduce the mortality disparities between wealthy and poor is to make the poor less poor, is social equity. But until and unless we accomplish that, it turns out that green space is a way to blunt those health disparities, and that's kind of a superpower. So parks are inequitably distributed. Access to parks disproportionately benefits people that were poor and reduces health inequities. And we need to be careful because when we provide neighborhoods that are deprived of greenery or parks with those amenities, property values go up and the people who've lived there for a long time may get displaced, a phenomenon called green gentrification. We have a lot of evidence on this phenomenon, and we have a fair amount of insight now into ways to reduce it, if not entirely prevent it. It's hard to entirely prevent in a market economy, but if you support affordable housing, if you require that developers provide affordable housing, if you empower the community in the course of creating the parks and green space, if you link the provision of parks and green space with vocational training, with small business development, with other economic development strategies, then you can reduce the displacement that may come from green gentrification. And then green gentrification becomes a good thing, which is you're making neighborhoods more and more livable and healthy for the people who live there and who get to stay there. The next couple of things I wanted to talk about were some of the scientific uncertainty that we have regarding all of this, and some of the questions that remain to be investigated, and some of the policy actions we can take to help implement the insights that I just talked about. And I think I'm going to quit at this point and open up for discussion. Unless, well, if anybody has questions on those, I can go back and show some more slides.
I have a question. I don't know
Wendy.
very much. Thank you so much. That was incredible. And um, I've learned I've learned through you and others, like Tony Sandoval, who runs, right, the community program office, who used to work in Parks and Rec, right, in Anaheim, I think. So much about this, how important parks are. And I'm wondering, in terms of something D'Artagnan Scorza shared with me a little while ago, and for those that don't know who he is, he's in charge of the diversity and equities inaugural position for all of LA County. And he told me that the marina is owned by LA, and that the not and Marina Del Rey at that property, and the lease is coming up. And so he's making sure that that lease, next round of all those fancy apartments, make sure there's affordable housing. What other kinds of opportunities are you aware of like that, around green spaces, that might be something that especially our students could be activists around?
Well, south of, I'm blanking on the name of the neighborhood, Wendy. There's a neighborhood in the southern part of LA. I'll think of it probably the second this call is over, where there is it's a largely Latino low-income neighborhood with a lot of industrial infrastructure there. They have pulled together and are doing phenomenal work at creating mini parks and green pathways in alleyways. And what's coming with that is a sense of community empowerment, so that those green spaces function not only as green spaces, but as social infrastructure, as tools to build community empowerment. Um, and that is one of the superpowers of not only of green spaces, but of the process of communities coming together and demanding and designing and raising funds for and implementing green spaces. Pacoima, and the community group is called Pacoima Beautiful. And it's a great example there in LA. If you go up north to near where Dick lives, India Basin is a big development in the Bay Area that is coming together now with a lot of community engagement. It'll have a lot of green space in it, as well as affordable housing. And that there too, it was the early and authentic engagement of the community groups in the area that really helped steer that. So there will be affordable housing. There will be rent subsidization for people in the area who are already there. There will be small business development and vocational training and other forms of community investment to build the economic base in the community and strengthen it. And all of that leads to community empowerment, which is health promoting itself, but also comes on the back of putting an infrastructure in place that will be health promoting. Dick. Dick and then Todd.
Howie, that, sorry, Todd, that was just spectacular. And I thought I knew a lot of this stuff, and I continue to always be astounded. When I think of parks, I always have this Frederick Law Olmsted picture in my mind. And in fact, the hot map of New York City shows that Olmsted was right all along. It's the lungs of the city. It cools us down. And many of the benefits that you outlined with the science behind it now were projected by him 125, 150 years ago. But I think of these parks as sort of these giant rectangles, and yet some of the parks that have fascinated me, like I'm a Jersey guy, so the west side of the Hudson River was unbearable between the Superfund sites and the docks and the crime and all the rest. And now we will have a walking trail that goes from the George Washington Bridge down to about 20 miles to the Bayonne Bridge. This is a big deal. And you see people of all ethnicities and colors out there getting along perfectly well as they look out over the city and the climate. But it brings me a quick thought, because when you go to Italy, you go to Mexico, the park is often the town square where people got together and socialize, and there is commercial and there is other things. I wonder if you might want to think aloud a little bit about that, because I think the loneliness arguments we're making, I found it very touching, for example.
You know, there are, I guess, some partially separable phenomena, Dick. There's the ability to get together with other people in a town square in Italy happens despite the absence of nature in that town square. And it's still a good thing because people get to sit with each other and socialize and hang out. I would postulate that it would work even better if there were natural amenities in that town square because there's a separate beneficial effect we know from contact with nature. I'm reflecting, I just came back from a bike ride in Italy a couple of weeks ago, and at one point I rode through a small town. There was only one cafe in the town for my coffee break, and there were about 6 old men sitting on what really was a block, 1 block by 1 block town square that was grassy with trees, and there were park benches, and old men were sitting there. And they were curious about bicyclists. We got to talking. Turns out they meet there every day, and they just hang out with each other. They're pensioners. It was the perfect demonstration of a shared space that was great for social connectedness, enhanced by the presence of nature with vegetation and some grassy areas. So I think they're 2 good things. And when they come together, it's even better.
Let me supplement the question a little bit because a lot of the stuff that happened along the Hudson was Superfund money that really made it change. And has the Trust for Public Land been thinking about capitalizing on, because that's a lot of money, as you well know.
Yeah, we have. In fact, the park that I will be taking my dog to walk at after we finish this call is called Pritchard Park. Pritchard, I have to tell you, was a guy here on Bainbridge Island who also was the inventor of what's that new game instead of tennis that everybody plays?
Pickleball?
Pickleball, yeah. So he was the inventor of pickleball. That's not the reason that the park is named for him. He was actually a civic guy here. It's a Superfund site. It used to be a wood treatment facility, and it is a beautiful beach park now where people can take their dogs and walk and swim. Part of it's still off limits because the contamination underground is being pumped out. But yeah, the challenge there, and TPL is actually pretty good at this, is, for lack of a better term, and not to sound transactional, but doing the deal. So you have to put together the federal funding, which may come from Superfund or may come from the responsible parties who did the polluting. You have to identify a local park authority that's willing to take ownership of the park once it's cleaned up. You have to establish a cleanup plan. You have to get community buy-in. So it's a complicated multivariable equation. And I assume that the New Jersey trail you talked about, Dick, was 10 times more complicated. There's multiple jurisdictions and
In the mafia.
multiple polluters. Yeah. But yeah, I think that the riverside properties across the country that were neglected for years, they were just treated as industrial sites and the rivers as garbage cans, now turn out we're recognizing to be fantastic resources. They offer green space and what's called blue space, access to water, which has its own whole set of benefits.
Thank you.
So actually, that's all of those questions are very related to things that I was wondering about myself. And also just hello to Bainbridge Island. I used to live in Seattle. I still have family up in Bainbridge, so nice to connect that way. But one of the things that we see both here on campus, because we have a very kind of dense campus where we want to preserve the existing kind of park-like spaces that we have and sort of those lungs of the campus. But also, I think in our wider region, as we're trying to provide better access to housing, better density, and so on. The example you had of Tacoma was very interesting. I think there is a sort of natural tension between preserving more open space and densifying. And I'm curious, a lot of the sort of compromise measures have to be either, yes, it's mostly paved, or all the plants are potted, or they're all on balconies or things like that. I don't know if there's a scientific basis for sort of, the intuitive sense that, either more nature or, more robustly planted nature or naturally occurring nature is better, if there's a sort of gradation there, or if it's basically a matter of, as you densify, try to at least make sure that you have some amount of that connection, and that it's a bit more like quality than quantity. I mean, I'm thinking of kind of pocket parks in the East Coast, or small backyard gardens and row houses and things like that. And that kind of stuff is very, feasible within a dense environment, but it can often be a challenge to kind of get much larger than that in certain, land situations. So what's the kind of rule of thumb in those cases, I guess?
Boy, it's a great question, Dick. Todd, it's, debates between good and bad are pretty easy. You always go for the good. Debates between good and good are a lot tougher. Density is good. We need density. We need a lot more housing in this country because we have a shortage of affordable housing and people are homeless. We need density and we need nature contact. And so the way to reconcile those two is probably lies in really good design that optimizes people's access to natural spaces while also creating dense, attractive urban fabric. Do we have all the science we need to inform that design? I don't think so. So you asked the question that does a pocket park provide as much benefit as a large park? Well, probably not. Large parks offer much more opportunity for physical activity than pocket parks. But in pocket parks, if done well, you get a dose of nature, which is a good thing, and you get the possibility of social interactions. It's a good thing too. So I think knowing exactly what design strategies allow the most density in the most aesthetically appealing way and confer as many of the benefits of nature and green space as possible. That's one of the holy grails of research in this area. So any of the students on the call who want to go into this field, those are some of the research questions that are out there.
That was very similar, Todd. I'm glad you asked that to the question I have, which is really about what scale is necessary. Is there any evidence suggesting what gets us there? And I suppose where I'm coming from is being in transportation is medians, roadway medians, landscape medians. Doctor, have you ever seen any evidence or papers that discuss anything about greenery within medians, within transportation projects or facilities, trees? I know that there is a traffic calming effect, but I'm wondering if there's any research you're aware of that kind of connects to those thoughts.
Thanks for the question, David. I'm aware of research on street tree canopy in cities. There's actually a pretty robust body of evidence there, showing, for example, that on streets with slightly more dense tree canopy, you have demonstrably lower use of antidepressant medications or demonstrably lower self-reporting of anxiety. So street trees certainly are documented to do good for people. But that's only one configuration in which trees sit along streets. The median question that you just asked about, I'm not aware of any data.
Okay, thank you. Because, my motive is when we put these things in on campus, there's costs associated with landscaping that sometimes the powers that be want to value engineer that out. It'd be nice to have some evidence saying that, no, this really matters and it's important. So I like the canopy thing though. Thank you for that.
Sure. Paula, your hand is up. But Paula, you're the boss of this show, so you can call on yourself.
Sorry, I think Monica had a question before me.
I'll go for it, Paula. I'll go next.
Okay, mine can be like really quick answer. But I was wondering, on one of your slides, there was like a study that was like about perceived safety. Like, how does that how do like green spaces and parks affect safety?
Yeah, and that is a little bit of code. The problem there is that people of color have historically been unwelcome in some parks. And that may be a feeling that continues to this day based on good reason, or even if it's just a matter of historical legacy that lingers on, it's of concern. The solution to that is to create parks and park configurations, park amenities, the park design and oversight process, all including all of the users who will potentially benefit from the park. So engaging communities, as I said before, setting up programs that allow people to mix and mingle and reduce barriers. The intergroup contact can be designed into parks. If you have a a Mexican or Guatemalan population or a Somali population using the park, you can allow or encourage murals or other art that helps people feel a sense of cultural identity there. And that sense of welcome and belonging and even ownership of a park greatly helps to make people feel more safe. And there's the question of crime. One of the major barriers people in cities report, especially in low income areas, to going to the park is the fear of crime. So, and there you can set up a virtuous cycle. More people in the park means more eyes in the park, which makes the park safer, which means more people in the park. So security strategies, good maintenance so that the park doesn't look decrepit and people want to go there. Neighborhood ownership of the parks. I don't mean literal ownership, but I mean stewardship of the parks. All of those things can help displace any criminal activity.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Monica.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is so great, the discussion and the presentation. So my question is around funding. It's always wonderful when you see this park come up, but then, 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years, 20, when you really do need the maintenance of that park and the streams of funding to continue the programming, that always seems to be the big challenge. And so I'm curious, what is your advice around how do you keep people's interest in maintaining parks long term? And what is the Trust for Public Land doing to perhaps, galvanize some of that initiative with, elected officials, community partners, and so forth?
Boy, thank you, Monica. Great question. And Paula, we have another hour, right? So
I will.
let me say a few things. So one of the parts of TPL that I like the best is it's called ConFin, Conservation Finance. This is a part of the organization that scouts around the country for places where we think and where polling and focus grouping substantiate the view that people are willing to dip into their pockets to pay for parks. And then we organize local referenda, either for bond issues or for taxation, so that communities will decide to come up with money to pay for parks. Obviously, this only works in communities where there's a little bit of money to come up with. But we have about an 85% success rate in running these elections. And the important thing is that these elections are as successful in blue areas as in red areas. So this is one of those issues that actually cuts across the ideological divides that bedevil the country. So number one would be organizing communities, doing political campaigning to make the case for parks and green space, and then providing a mechanism through which people can come up with the money themselves as taxpayers to support the parks. A second issue that I'm really excited about is deploying healthcare dollars to fund parks and green space. There is ample evidence, as I hope I've persuaded you, that parks are health infrastructure. Now, hospitals, under the terms of the Affordable Care Act, IRS regulations, have to engage in community investments. They do community health needs assessments and then decide how to do community investments. For many years, those investments consisted of paying uncompensated care for uninsured people who came to the hospital. And the hospitals then said, well, we're done. But now, with more people covered and fewer people uninsured, hospitals have a little more wiggle room. And it's entirely legitimate for a hospital to say our community investment based on the findings in our community health needs assessment will be a park in this community, which is deprived of park space. Similarly, states can ask for Medicaid waivers and can use Medicaid funding under the terms of a waiver for things other than clinical care. A number of states have done this in recent years. There's no reason why parks and green space can't be a part of the Medicaid revenue stream. This is not diversion. This is investment in something that we know is effective health infrastructure. So local initiatives, bond issues, and taxation to raise money for parks. The second is deploying healthcare dollars to fund parks and green space. And then the third is creative public-private partnerships where there's no reason why a park can't have a destination space in it that it can rent out for weddings or concerts, or can't have vending areas in it where the companies that come in to sell food can kick back some money to the parks. Wouldn't it be a great idea if every park had EV charging infrastructure so that people could come in, maybe they live in a multi-unit dwelling or don't have access to a charging unit. They can come in, charge their car and charge their soul at the same time. And that could spin off a revenue stream for the parks. So there are lots of potential revenue streams that support parks and green space. And then I guess underlying it all is the kind of evidence that I shared with you all and the kind of arguments that you routinely make about the built environment should persuade city officials, city council members and mayors that parks are a really good investment and deserve to be not just a nice to have, but a must have as cities do their budgeting. So plain old fashioned citizen lobbying based on solid evidence is a way to make the case for parks in the face of many other competing demands for city funds.
All right, thank you
That's
so
so great.
much.
Thank you.
And in the interest of time, we're gonna skip the announcements, but if anyone has any announcements, if they can drop it in the chat, that would be awesome. And Dick and Dave will be speaking a little bit about just closing up the year.
Thank you, Paula. I'm going to cede most of my time to Dick since we have a few minutes left, but I want to say thank you to the team. First, Wendy, thank you for your support as always. And Monica, we will miss you. You've done a stellar job of your time as a GSR for the Built Environment Work Group. Much thanks to you. And Paula, great job today. You've been here a short time, but we're very appreciative of that time. And I think that you've enjoyed your time with us. And we hope to see you in the future. And all of you, I think we'll have a good year next year. So we hope to see you again when we reconvene in the fall. But Dr. Jackson, heat up for you.
Well, of course, I had a prepared talk, not really, but the thought that came out of all of this is, sorry, the dog wants to protect me from something. Was one word, and I think it's what UCLA is about, which is leadership. And when Howie was looking at doing parks at TPL, I thought, well, gee, that's kind of a small pond for you to be splashing around in, given your immense experience. And he has turned it into an ocean during that same period of time. And it's using all of one's abilities, all of one's training, life experiences, and creating transformation. I think my big takeaway is next year, Be Well, one of our big goals ought to be to create a pipeline of interns to work for Trust for Public Land, because it was, and our grad student assistants have been absolutely superb. And it's, of all the things I've been proud of, this, the changes we've made on campus are great, but the people we have produced have been superb. And Wendy, your wonderful approach, your kindness, your openness has really been transformative with this whole effort. Looking forward to next year. I'll be quiet at that point, but thank you so much. Particularly thank you to Dr. Frumkin. Great presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dick and Howie.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, I suppose everyone have a great summer. And we'll see you in the fall for the fall quarter. Take care.
Wonderful summer, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Summer.
Bye-bye. Thank you again,
Bye.
Howie.
Thank you.